Marcus adjusted the strap of his faded travel bag and stepped into the boarding line without hesitation. Around him, people checked expensive watches, rolled polished suitcases, and glanced toward the priority entrance where passengers in tailored suits disappeared behind smiling attendants. Ava looked up at him. "Dad, are we in the right line?" Marcus smiled softly. "We're exactly where we're supposed to be." She nodded, tightening her grip on the old backpack hanging from her shoulder. "It looks older than everyone else's. It still carries what matters," Ava laughed quietly. "My books? And your courage," she smiled, though she wasn't entirely sure what he meant. The line moved forward a few steps. A woman in designer sunglasses glanced at Marcus's worn sneakers before looking away. A businessman behind them sighed loudly. "Some people really don't know how to travel," he muttered. Under his breath, Marcus heard him. He said nothing. Yodeve heard him too. She looked at her father. "They talking about us?" Marcus answered gently. "Sometimes people speak before they understand. But that isn't fair." "No," he replied. "It isn't." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. Near the boarding counter, two airline employees watched the line. One leaned closer to the other. The father and daughter in the gray jackets. "The ones with the old backpack?" "Yeah, they don't exactly look like first-class passengers. You should double-check their tickets." The second employee hesitated. "They're already standing in the correct line. I know, just check anyway." Neither employee noticed Marcus quietly observing them from a distance. His expression never changed. He simply watched. Ava tugged gently on his sleeve. "Can I ask something?" "You always can." "Why do people keep looking at us?" Marcus took a slow breath. "Because sometimes people create stories before they know the truth." "Do they ever feel bad afterward?" "They can. And if they don't?" He looked at her for a moment. "Then the problem stays with them, not with us." She thought carefully before nodding. "I think that's hard." "It is." A man pushing a silver suitcase stepped directly in front of Marcus, pretending not to notice he had cut the line. Marcus remained still. The man glanced back. "Oh, were you standing there?" "Yes." A short pause followed. Instead of apologizing, the man shrugged. "It won't make much difference," Marcus answered calmly. "You're right." The man frowned. Surprised, Marcus continued. "It tells us something much bigger than where we're standing." The man looked uncomfortable. Without another word, he quietly stepped back behind Marcus. No apology came. None was needed. Several passengers had witnessed the exchange. A young college student whispered to her friend. He didn't even get angry. Her friend nodded. "I don't think I could stay that calm." Across the terminal, another airline worker scanned boarding passes. She looked toward Marcus again. "For some reason, everyone's watching that family," her supervisor answered quietly. "Just keep things moving." The words sounded routine, but the supervisor's eyes lingered longer than expected. Marcus bent down beside Ava. "Nervous?" "A little." "About flying?" She shook her head. "About people." Marcus rested a hand on her shoulder. "Never let strangers decide who you are." She smiled faintly. "I'll try." "No." He smiled back. "You'll do it." The boarding announcement echoed across the terminal. "Passengers for Flight 728 may now begin." Boarding. The line started moving. A flight attendant stood at the entrance, greeting passengers with practiced smiles. "Good morning." "Welcome aboard." "Have a pleasant flight." When Marcus and Ava reached the front, the attendant accepted their boarding passes. Her smile faded for only a second. She looked from the tickets to Marcus, then to Ava, then back again. Her eyes narrowed almost invisibly. She scanned the passes twice. Marcus noticed. He didn't react. Ava noticed, too. She whispered, "Did something go wrong?" Marcus looked ahead. Not yet. The attendant finally forced another smile. One moment, please. Her voice remained polite, but something underneath it had changed. Several people waiting behind them began watching. No one spoke. No one needed to. The atmosphere shifted almost without sound. Marcus quietly folded his hands in front of him. He had entered the terminal looking like an ordinary father. That was exactly the point. Wasn't there to be recognized. He was there to discover how ordinary people were treated when nobody believed they mattered. And, standing at that boarding gate, he realized the test had already begun. Marcus accepted the brief delay without complaint. The flight attendant disappeared behind the counter with their boarding passes, leaving him and Ava standing in a silence that seemed longer than it truly was. Around them, impatient travelers checked their watches, but Marcus's attention drifted elsewhere. A young soldier embraced his elderly mother near the window. Across the terminal, a little girl ran into her father's arms after spotting him at the security exit. Those ordinary reunions stirred a memory he carried every day. His late wife had loved watching people in airports. She used to smile and whisper, "Every suitcase carries a different story." He could almost hear her voice again, calm and certain despite the years that had passed. During the final weeks of her illness, when the future had become painfully clear, she had taken his hand and said, "Promise me something." "I promise," he had answered before she even finished. She smiled weakly. Never let wealth become louder than character. If Ava grows up believing money makes someone important, we've both failed. Marcus had squeezed her hand. "She'll know better." "Teach her with your life," she whispered. "Not your words." The memory faded as the present returned. Ava gently tugged his sleeve. "Dad, I'm here. You look sad. I was remembering someone who always knew the right thing to say." "Mom?" He nodded. What would she say right now? A faint smile reached his face. "She'd remind us that kindness is easiest when nobody's watching." Ava smiled back. "Then we're doing okay. We're trying." The boarding passes were still missing, but Marcus remained perfectly calm. Every quiet moment reminded him that leadership meant nothing. If it disappeared, the instant respect became inconvenient. That promise still guided every decision he made, especially when nobody recognized his name. Behind them, whispers began replacing ordinary conversation. A middle-aged couple glanced toward Marcus and Ava before leaning closer together. "They've been stopped. A long time," the man murmured. "There must be some problem with their tickets," his wife replied. Teenager looked up from his phone. "I thought first-class passengers dressed differently." His friend shrugged. "Maybe. They're confused. None of them knew Marcus could hear every word." Ava lowered her eyes. "Why are they talking about us?" Marcus answered quietly. "Because people sometimes fill empty spaces with assumptions instead of facts." She frowned but stayed silent. More passengers turned their attention toward them. A businessman whispered to another traveler who immediately looked Marcus over from head to toe. Their ordinary clothes, worn backpack, and patient silence became enough for strangers to invent an entire story. No accusation had been spoken aloud, yet quiet suspicion had already decided where they belonged. Marcus accepted the boarding passes, without asking why they had taken so long. He thanked the attendant with the same calm voice he had used from the beginning, then guided Ava down the jet bridge. She skipped beside him, her excitement returning as the aircraft came into view. "This plane is bigger than I imagined," she whispered. "It carries many stories," Marcus replied. "Today, ours is one of them." Inside the cabin, Marcus found their assigned first-class seats without hesitation. He placed his travel bag beneath the seat, helped Ava settle beside the window, and fastened her seatbelt. "Look, Dad," she said, pointing outside. "The wings look huge." "They do. I can see the whole airport." "I know you can." Her smile spread naturally, untouched by the whispers that had followed them through the terminal. The passengers nearby were not as relaxed. A woman across the aisle paused halfway through placing her purse overhead. Two businessmen exchanged uncertain glances before checking their boarding passes again. A couple leaned together without speaking, their expressions asking questions they were unwilling to voice aloud. Near the galley, two flight attendants noticed the growing silence. Seat 2A and 2B. One whispered, "That's what the system shows." "Are you sure?" The scanner accepted their boarding passes. Neither sounded convinced. The atmosphere shifted without anyone raising a voice. Conversations faded one by one until only the quiet hum of the aircraft remained. Marcus noticed every glance but kept his attention on Ava. His sleeve slipped back slightly as he reached for her backpack, revealing the edge of a remarkably expensive watch before the cuff covered it again. Hidden inside his weathered travel bag rested sealed corporate documents marked confidential. No passenger could see them. No crew member imagined the truth. The ordinary father, quietly watching his daughter admire the runway, carried an authority that could reshape the airline's future, yet he offered no hint of the power resting silently beside his feet. The last few passengers entered the cabin, filling the remaining seats with rolling suitcases, quiet greetings, and the familiar sounds of travel. Nothing appeared unusual to anyone walking through the aisle, yet the tension surrounding Marcus and Ava lingered like an unanswered question. Ava pressed her forehead against the window. "Dad, do you think we'll see the clouds before sunset?" "I think you'll see something even more beautiful." "What?" "A reminder that the world always looks different when you rise above it." She smiled, satisfied with the answer. Across the aisle, another passenger lowered his voice. "They still haven't moved," his companion replied. "Maybe the crew is waiting for a supervisor." Neither realized Marcus could hear every word. He didn't interrupt. He simply watched. Years of experience had taught him that people often revealed their character most clearly when they believed they were unnoticed. Every glance, every whisper, every hesitant smile told a story that policies and employee handbooks could never capture. A flight attendant walked past their row, offering polite smiles to everyone except Marcus. The omission lasted only a second, but it was impossible to ignore. Ava noticed. "Did I do something wrong?" Marcus turned toward her immediately. "No, sweetheart." "Then why didn't she smile?" "Sometimes people carry burdens they don't understand." Ava nodded slowly, though the answer left questions in her eyes. Near the front galley, two crew members exchanged another uneasy look, before one quietly disappeared behind the curtain leading toward the cockpit. Marcus followed the movement without changing his expression. The aircraft remained peaceful. Passengers settled into their seats. Seat belts clicked into place. Everything looked perfectly ordinary. Yet beneath the calm, invisible assumptions were quietly steering ordinary choices toward extraordinary consequences. Within minutes, a single decision born from prejudice would uncover years of hidden discrimination, changing countless lives far beyond this flight forever. Marcus gently squeezed Ava's hand as the final passengers continued filing into the first-class cabin. The steady rhythm of rolling suitcases, quiet greetings, and overhead bins closing blended into the familiar soundtrack of boarding. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Ava remained focused on the window, watching baggage carts weave across the tarmac with quiet fascination. "Dad, that little truck is pulling the airplane," she whispered. Marcus smiled. "It helps prepare the journey. Wish I could drive one someday. You can become anything you choose." She grinned and returned to the window. Across the aisle, a middle-aged couple paused before taking their seats. The woman glanced toward Marcus, then quietly leaned toward her husband. "Are those seats assigned to them?" He shrugged. "I don't know. They don't look like first class. Travelers." He lowered his voice even further. "Maybe they're waiting for someone." Marcus heard every word without changing his expression. His attention remained on Ava, nearby. A flight attendant slowed her pace as she walked past row 2. She looked at Marcus's worn jacket, then at Ava's faded backpack resting beneath the seat. She hesitated. Another attendant approached. "Everything okay?" "I think so. You think so?" They're seated in 2A and 2B. The system allowed them through? It did. Neither attendant moved closer to verify the reservation. Instead, they exchanged uncertain glances before quietly continuing toward the galley. Their hesitation spoke louder than any question. Businessman removed his glasses and looked directly at Marcus. Another passenger followed his gaze. Within moments, several conversations had faded into silence. Nobody accused him, nobody welcomed him. Cabin settled into an uncomfortable stillness where curiosity slowly became judgment. Ava finally noticed. Yes? Why is everyone so quiet? Marcus looked around the cabin before answering. Sometimes people become quiet when they're trying to understand something. Are they trying to understand us? He paused. Maybe. But they don't know us. No. Then how can they decide? Marcus smiled gently. That's a question many adults still struggle to answer. Ava rested her head against his shoulder. I don't like when people guess. I don't either. She looked toward the aisle again. I wish they would just ask. Marcus nodded. So do I. At that moment, the curtain separating the cockpit from the first-class cabin shifted slightly. A tall man in a neatly pressed captain's uniform stepped into the aisle with practiced confidence. His polished shoes echoed softly against the cabin floor as several crew members immediately straightened their posture. Without saying a word, he acknowledged the attendants with a brief nod before scanning the cabin. His eyes moved casually from row to row, then they stopped. They settled on Marcus and Ava. The captain's expression barely changed, just a slight narrowing of his eyes. A nearly invisible pause. He looked once at Marcus, then at Ava, then at their seats. One of the attendants noticed the captain's reaction. She quietly lowered her eyes instead of speaking. Another shifted uneasily but remained silent. He met the captain's gaze for only a moment before returning his attention to Ava. He had seen that look before. It was the look of someone who believed he already knew the entire story before asking a single question. The captain took one slow step toward row 2. Another followed. The growing silence inside the cabin seemed to travel with him. Passengers instinctively stopped pretending not to watch. Without realizing it, the entire front section of the aircraft had begun holding its breath. Marcus remained seated as the captain stopped beside row 2. His posture was relaxed, his hands resting lightly on the armrests. Ava looked up from the window, sensing that something had changed even before a word was spoken. Captain Richard Coleman offered a polite smile that never reached his eyes. "Good afternoon." "Good afternoon," Marcus replied. The captain glanced briefly at the seat numbers, then back at Marcus. "I'm afraid there's been a mistake." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "A mistake?" "Yes." The captain pointed calmly toward the curtain separating first class from the rest of the aircraft. "Economy is through that curtain. If you'll gather your things, a flight attendant will help you find your correct seats." The words were delivered with absolute confidence, as though no explanation could possibly be necessary. Ava looked at her. "Father? Dad?" Marcus gently squeezed her hand. "It's all right." He looked back at the captain. "I believe these are our assigned seats." The captain's smile became thinner. "I understand why you might think that." He reached into his jacket pocket without hurry and removed 2 boarding passes. "Would you mind checking them?" He extended the tickets respectfully. "Captain." Coleman accepted them with 2 fingers. His eyes barely touched the printed information before he folded them closed again. "I'm sure guest services will sort this out." Gus remained calm. "Did you have a chance to read the seat numbers?" "I don't need to." The answer settled over the cabin like a heavy blanket. One flight attendant shifted her weight uncomfortably. Another quietly looked away. Neither spoke, neither asked to verify the reservation in the system. The captain handed the boarding passes back. I'm asking you once more, sir. Please move to your assigned cabin so we can depart on time. Marcus accepted the tickets without argument. My assigned cabin is this one. For the first time, a faint crease appeared across the captain's forehead. I've flown this aircraft for 23 years. I'm sure you have. I know who belongs in this section. Marcus held his gaze without raising his voice. Respectfully, Captain, the boarding pass usually decides that. Silence. Businessman near the aisle cleared his throat but said nothing. A woman across the cabin slowly lowered the magazine she had been pretending to read. The attendants remained frozen between duty and doubt. VTV leaned closer to her father. Did we do something wrong? Marcus looked at her before answering. No, sweetheart. Then why does he want us to leave? Marcus chose his words carefully. Sometimes people believe their first impression more than the facts. The captain heard every word. His jaw tightened. This discussion is over. Marcus answered with the same steady tone. It could be. He held up the boarding passes again. If someone simply reads them. The request was simple. No accusation, no anger, only an invitation to verify the truth. Yet no one stepped forward. The cabin had quietly divided itself. On one side stood authority. On the other stood evidence, and for reasons few could explain, authority was winning without ever proving it was right. Captain Richard Coleman stepped into the first-class cabin with the steady confidence of someone accustomed to instant obedience. Conversations faded as crew members acknowledged him with respectful nods. He greeted a few familiar travelers before his attention settled on Marcus and Ava. His smile disappeared almost immediately. He slowed his pace and frowned. His eyes moved from Marcus's ordinary shirt to Ava's worn backpack before returning to their faces. He stopped beside them. Sir, Richard said evenly, pointing toward the curtain behind them, economy is through there. You must have boarded the wrong section. Marcus looked up calmly. I believe we're exactly where we're supposed to be. Richard folded his arms. I've been doing this job for 25 years. Mistakes happen. Please take your daughter and move before everyone finishes. Boarding. Ava looked at her father without speaking. Marcus answered quietly. We're seated according to our tickets. Richard's expression hardened. Sir, don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. Without changing his tone, Marcus reached inside his jacket pocket and removed 2 boarding passes. Would you mind checking these first? Richard barely glanced at the cards before pushing them gently back toward Marcus. I don't need to. I've seen enough. The words landed heavier than the gesture itself. Marcus held the passes in his hand but made no effort to argue. Instead, he asked one calm question. So your decision was made before you looked? Richard answered without hesitation. My responsibility is keeping this cabin organized. Around them, the nearby flight attendants remained perfectly still. No one interrupted. No one verified the boarding information. Their silence quietly strengthened the captain's assumption, allowing authority to replace procedure while the cabin waited for someone to choose fairness over unquestioned rank. Marcus did not answer immediately. The silence left behind by Captain Richard's refusal seemed to stretch across the cabin, pressing against every occupied seat. No one spoke. The flight attendants avoided looking toward Marcus, while several passengers quietly pretended to study magazines they had not turned a single page of. Ava sat perfectly still beside her father, her fingers still wrapped tightly around his hand. She could feel the strange heaviness surrounding them, even if she could not understand its source. She slowly looked around the cabin. Every face seemed different. Now. Some watched openly. Others looked away. The moment. Her eyes met theirs. A woman across the aisle lowered her gaze. A businessman cleared his throat. Without saying anything, even the cheerful excitement that usually filled boarding had quietly disappeared. Ava leaned closer. until her shoulder rested gently against Marcus. Her voice was barely louder than a whisper. "Daddy." Marcus turned toward her with the same calm expression he had worn since the confrontation. Began, "Yes, sweetheart?" She hesitated, searching his face before speaking again. "Did we do something wrong?" The question landed harder than every accusation spoken moments earlier. Marcus felt his chest tighten. For a brief second, memories of countless similar moments from his own childhood flashed through his mind. Times when silence had been mistaken for guilt simply because of how he looked. He refused to let that same burden settle onto his daughter. He gently squeezed her hand. "No, Ava." She searched his eyes carefully. Then, "Why is everyone looking at us?" Marcus offered a small, reassuring smile. "Sometimes, people decide who someone is before they learn who they really are." Ava looked around the cabin once more. She nodded slowly but did not fully understand. Still holding her father's hand, she whispered one quiet word. "Oh." The cabin remained silent. But now that silence belonged to everyone who had heard the question and still found nothing to say. Marcus brushed a loose strand of hair away from Ava's forehead before answering. His voice stayed warm, steady, almost comforting, despite the tension surrounding them. "Sweetheart, sometimes people mistake confidence for permission," he said softly. She blinked. "Permission to do what?" "Permission to decide things about someone they don't really know." Ava frowned. "But they never talk to us." "I know." "Then how can they know anything?" "They can't," Marcus replied. "That's why we never let someone else's assumptions decide how we see ourselves." She thought quietly for a moment. "So, we shouldn't be angry." Marcus smiled gently. "We can feel hurt without becoming hurtful. Kindness doesn't mean weakness. It means choosing who we want to be, even when someone else forgets." Ava squeezed his hand again. "I want to be like you." Marcus's smile grew, though sadness lingered behind it. "I want you to become even better." His words settled gently between them, replacing fear with something steadier. Around them, however, the atmosphere only grew heavier. The nearby passengers had heard every sentence. One elderly woman slowly removed her glasses and stared at the floor. A businessman closed his laptop without reading another line. A young couple exchanged uneasy glances but remained silent. The flight attendants stood exactly where they were, their practiced smiles long gone. None of them questioned the captain's decision. None stepped forward to verify the boarding passes still resting in Marcus's hand. Procedure had surrendered to rank. Fairness had surrendered to hesitation. The cabin felt strangely smaller, as though every quiet breath carried the same unanswered question. No one defended Marcus. No one repeated the captain's accusation. Yet no one challenged it either. In that painful stillness, silence became the loudest voice in first class, quietly protecting prejudice while dignity remained seated, waiting for truth to catch up. Captain Richard Coleman finally broke the silence by taking one deliberate step closer to Marcus's seat. His expression remained controlled, but the patience in his voice had begun to disappear. "Sir," he said firmly, "I've asked you politely. I'm asking one final time. Please move to the correct cabin." Marcus met his eyes without hostility. "Captain, I've already shown you our boarding passes. I've made my decision." Without checking them, Richard's jaw tightened. "My responsibility is maintaining order. Every minute you remain here delays boarding," Marcus answered quietly. "Order and fairness should never compete." The words were calm, yet they unsettled the captain more than an argument would have. To Richard, Marcus's composure no longer looked respectful. It looked like resistance. "You are refusing a direct instruction. I'm asking you to verify the facts. I don't need another discussion." Around them, the crew remained frozen. Richard's confidence drew its strength from their silence. No one questioned him. No one reminded him of company. Policy, authority had begun mistaking cruelty for control. Near the galley, a young flight attendant named Emily clutched the passenger manifest against her chest. She had watched the exchange from the beginning, and something inside her refused to settle. She whispered to the senior attendant beside her, "Shouldn't we check the boarding passes first?" The older attendant shot her a warning look. Not now. But what if? Emily. The single word ended the conversation. Emily lowered her eyes immediately. She knew the rules. Questioning a captain in front of the passengers could end a promising career. She looked back at Ava, whose small hand still rested inside her father's. Guilt settled heavily in her stomach. She wanted to speak. Instead, she remained silent with everyone else, and the cabin became another place where fear protected power while conscience waited for someone braver to move first. Emily's lowered gaze was the last quiet movement before the tension shifted again. Captain Richard Coleman looked toward the lead flight attendant. His patience completely exhausted. "Call airport security," he said. The words echoed through the first-class cabin with startling clarity. No one moved for a heartbeat. Then the lead attendant reached for the intercom phone with trembling fingers. "Captain, are you certain?" Richard answered without hesitation. "I gave a lawful instruction." The passenger refused to comply. Marcus spoke before the call was placed. "I refuse to surrender my seat without anyone checking my ticket." "There is a difference." Richard ignored him. "Make the call." The attendant slowly nodded and relayed the request. Across the cabin, passengers exchanged uneasy glances. Several quietly unlocked their phones. One man adjusted his camera for a clearer view. A young woman near the aisle whispered, "Keep recording." No one raised a voice, no one tried to stop the captain. Yet the glowing screens, silently, announced that witnesses were no longer willing to forget what they had seen. Ava looked up at her father. "Are the police coming?" Marcus gently squeezed her hand. "Someone is coming, sweetheart. Are you scared?" He smiled softly. "No. Truth doesn't become weaker because more people misunderstand it." She leaned against his shoulder, trusting him completely. Richard watched the exchange with growing frustration. Their calmness unsettled him more than anger ever could. He expected panic. He expected pleading. Instead, he found quiet confidence. Outside the aircraft door, hurried footsteps echoed along the jet bridge. The request for security had already been received. Inside the cabin, every phone remained pointed forward. Every silent face carried the same uneasy expression. Without realizing it, the airline's own system was moving toward a confrontation with the man whose signature ultimately stood above every policy, every department, and every uniform aboard that aircraft. The footsteps outside the aircraft grew louder, but before anyone reached the cabin, another story quietly unfolded beneath the surface. A story hidden inside locked filing cabinets, archived emails, and forgotten complaint folders that few people had ever opened twice. Years earlier, a customer relations specialist placed a report into the airline's digital records. Passenger alleged racial profiling during boarding. Requested formal review. The complaint received an automatic acknowledgement within minutes. "Thank you for bringing this matter to our attention." After that, nothing. Months later, another report arrived. A black businessman described being asked 3 times to prove he belonged in first class while other passengers boarded without interruption. Again, the response sounded professional. Again, the investigation quietly disappeared. The files continued to grow. Different names, different flights. The same ending. Every document carried careful language that softened painful experiences into administrative phrases. Humiliation became customer dissatisfaction. Public embarrassment became boarding confusion. Discrimination became an isolated misunderstanding. On paper, the airline appeared responsive. Behind the paperwork, almost nothing changed. Internal tracking records slowly revealed a pattern impossible to ignore. Complaint after complaint reached the Office of Operations. Each one was logged. Each one received a reference number. Then the trail simply ended. Employees noticed the pattern but rarely discussed it aloud. During lunch breaks, whispers replaced conversations. They won't touch those cases. Someone higher up always closes them. I have a family. I'm not risking my job. Nobody needed to explain who higher up meant. Everyone already understood. The message spread quietly through departments. Do your work. Follow instructions. Do not challenge decisions made above your pay grade. Fear became part of the workplace culture. Not loud, not obvious, just constant. Among those reviewing many of the reports was Vice President Linda Graves. She rarely met complainants. She rarely appeared in public statements. Most passengers never knew her name. Yet her electronic approval appeared beneath countless internal decisions. No further action recommended. Insufficient evidence. Matter considered resolved. Each signature looked ordinary. Together they created something far more powerful than a single decision. They created permission for the same mistakes to happen again. Linda believed she was protecting the airline. Every unresolved complaint seemed like a crisis avoided. Every quiet settlement looked like stability. Every closed file felt like another headline prevented. She convinced herself that preserving public confidence served everyone. She never considered how many passengers quietly lost confidence because nobody believed them. One afternoon, years before Marcus boarded Flight 782, several managers gathered around a polished conference table. A compliance officer cleared his throat. "We've received multiple complaints involving similar allegations. I think we should reopen several investigations." The room fell silent. People exchanged cautious glances. Nobody interrupted. Finally, Linda folded her hands. It would damage the company's reputation. No anger, no raised voice, just one calm sentence. The compliance officer lowered his folder. Another manager slowly nodded. Someone changed the subject. The meeting ended exactly as it had begun. The investigations remained closed. Outside that conference room, flights departed on schedule. Passengers smiled for advertisements. Employees welcomed travelers with practiced professionalism. Behind those polished moments, the buried complaints continued waiting inside forgotten archives. The memory faded, and the present returned. Marcus still sat beside Ava. Captain Richard still stood before them. Passengers still held their phones. Nothing happening inside the cabin had truly started today. It had started years earlier, each time someone chose silence over honesty. Each ignored report became another brick in an invisible wall. Each frightened employee helped strengthen it. Each executive decision made it taller. Now that wall had finally begun to crack. No one inside first class could yet see every hidden file or forgotten meeting. They could only feel the weight of a system struggling to defend itself. The approaching. Security officers believed they were responding to one difficult passenger. In reality, they were walking into the accumulated consequences of years spent protecting appearances instead of truth, and the first fracture had finally become impossible to hide. Emily remained frozen near the galley as the waiting cabin dissolved into another memory hidden beneath years of forgotten paperwork. Every archived complaint carried a name, a date, and a flight number, yet behind those details lived people whose dignity had been quietly tested long before Marcus and Ava ever boarded this aircraft. One file belonged to Dr. Nathan Brooks, respected heart surgeon returning home after a 16-hour shift. His white coat had been replaced with a simple sweater, and exhaustion showed more clearly than success. He handed his first-class boarding pass to the gate agent with a polite smile. She studied it, then studied him. "May I see another form of identification?" He handed over his medical license without complaint. She examined it carefully before returning both cards. "I'm sorry, doctor. Standard procedure." Nathan nodded. He stepped toward the jet bridge. A second employee stopped him moments later. "Sir, may I verify your seat assignment?" He quietly offered the same boarding pass again. Nearby, passengers continued boarding without interruption. No one else was questioned. Nathan reached his seat, but the victory felt empty. He later wrote that the hardest part was not the delay. It was realizing that professional success disappeared the moment someone decided he looked out of place. Another forgotten report carried the name of Sergeant David Turner. 24 years in military service. Multiple commendations, a retirement ceremony attended by hundreds. Yet, while traveling to visit old friends, he was directed into additional screening twice within 15 minutes. A security officer apologized. Random selection. David smiled politely. "I understand." Around him, travelers watched for a moment before returning to their phones. Nobody asked why the same passenger had been selected again. Nobody questioned whether coincidence had quietly become habit. David gathered his belongings and continued walking with the steady posture the military had taught him decades earlier. His medals had earned respect on distant battlefields. Inside the airport, they could not shield him from suspicion dressed as routine procedure. Months later, another complaint entered the archive. Jordan Ellis, a young technology entrepreneur, arrived early for an investor meeting. His executive lounge membership was valid. His confirmation email was displayed clearly. The receptionist glanced at the screen before shaking her head. "I think you've made a mistake." Jordan remained courteous. "I travel through here every month. I'm afraid this lounge is reserved for executive members." "I am an executive member." She smiled politely but did not move aside. Several guests waiting nearby exchanged uncertain glances. Nobody interrupted. A supervisor eventually arrived, reviewed the account, and immediately apologized. "There was never a problem with your membership." Jordan accepted the apology. He entered the lounge. The coffee still tasted the same. The comfortable chairs still overlooked the runway. Yet the room no longer felt welcoming. Being admitted after proving you belong is not the same as being welcomed from the beginning. Another file told an even quieter story. Margaret Lewis was 73 years old. She carried homemade cookies wrapped carefully inside her handbag. She was flying to surprise her grandchildren for their school holiday. Security selected her for additional screening. She smiled patiently. "No problem." Minutes later, another checkpoint requested a second search. She quietly raised her arms again. A young officer avoided looking into her eyes. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience," Margaret answered with gentle kindness. "I know you're doing your job." She never complained inside the terminal. Only later, after reaching her destination, did she write one sentence that investigators quietly archived. "I wasn't embarrassed because they searched me. I was embarrassed because everyone watched and nobody wondered why it happened twice." The reports differed in details. Different airports, different employees, different years, the same quiet wound. None of these passengers demanded revenge. None asked for special treatment. They simply wanted to travel without first proving they deserved ordinary respect. Each complaint received a case number. Each was acknowledged with careful language. Each disappeared beneath polished corporate statements promising fairness and continuous improvement. Separated from one another, every incident appeared small enough to dismiss. Together, they revealed something impossible to ignore. The discrimination had never depended on one employee or one captain. It survived because silence connected every forgotten moment. An executive protected the company's image. Another victim walked away believing nothing would change. One brick alone could never build a wall. Years of ignored voices could. Back inside the first-class cabin, Marcus still waited beside Ava while passengers held their phones in silent anticipation. None of them knew the names inside those forgotten files. None had read the archived complaints. Yet all of them were now sitting inside the same story. For the first time in years, the system built from buried reports, fearful silence, and protected reputations had encountered someone who would neither surrender his dignity nor quietly disappear, and that difference was about to change everything. The uneasy silence inside the cabin lingered as passengers continued watching the aircraft door, waiting for airport security to arrive. Yet the truth, standing quietly beside Ava, had begun months before this flight, hidden behind an ordinary boarding pass that looked no different from anyone else's. 6 months earlier, Marcus Ellison signed the final documents transferring controlling ownership of the airline into his hands. The meeting lasted less than an hour. There were no cameras, no press conference, and no celebration. Only a small group of board members witnessed the signatures that changed the company's future. One director asked, "Shouldn't the public know immediately?" Marcus calmly shook his head. Not yet. Another executive looked surprised. Most owners announce themselves on the first day. Marcus closed the folder. "I don't need applause, I need the truth." From that moment forward, only a handful of board members knew who truly owned the airline. Employees continued believing Marcus was simply another successful investor reviewing company performance from a distance. The arrangement remained confidential, while a comprehensive operational audit quietly began across every department. Marcus insisted on one unusual condition: "I'll travel as an ordinary passenger." Several directors exchanged puzzled looks. "The executive terminal is available whenever you need it," one offered. Marcus smiled politely. "That's exactly why I won't use it." Weeks passed as he booked regular flights under his own name without requesting special assistance. He stood in ordinary security lines, waited beside families carrying vacation bags, listened to delayed passengers, and watched employees interact with people who believed nobody important was observing. He declined invitations to executive lounges. He carried his own luggage. He accepted small inconveniences without complaint. Each journey became another page in the story he was quietly collecting. Marcus believed company culture could never be measured inside conference rooms. It revealed itself only when employees thought power was absent. During one quiet evening at home before expanding the airline, his late wife had spoken words he never forgot. She poured 2 cups of tea onto the porch table and looked toward the setting sun. "If you ever lead something this big," she said gently, "promise me one thing." Marcus smiled. "Anything." She reached across the table and held his hand. "Never tell people who you are too quickly." He laughed softly. "Why?" "Because titles change behavior." She paused before continuing. "Watch who people become when they think you have nothing to offer. That's where their character lives." Those words settled deeply inside him. After her passing, they became more than a memory. They became a principle. Every important decision returned to that quiet conversation. Every ordinary flight honored the promise he had made. Months before today's confrontation, another confidential meeting gathered inside the airline's headquarters. Several board members reviewed progress reports from the hidden audit. One director shifted uneasily. Keeping ownership confidential creates unnecessary risk. Another disagreed. It also removes performance theater. Marcus listened before speaking. Reports tell us what people choose to write. He looked around the room. Real culture appears when nobody expects inspection. A veteran board member slowly nodded. "We'll maintain confidentiality." Another executive asked quietly, "For how long?" Marcus answered without hesitation. "Until the truth introduces itself." The room fell silent. No one argued further. The decision remained unanimous. The audit continued without public knowledge. Managers polished presentations. Departments submitted encouraging statistics. Customer satisfaction charts improved on paper. Meanwhile, Marcus kept boarding flights like every other traveler, searching for the difference between official reports and ordinary reality. He never expected humiliation. He expected honesty. He hoped to discover employees who solved problems before they reached executive offices. He hoped the complaints buried in old files represented a culture already changing. Instead, today's journey had uncovered something far more painful. No one recognized the owner. That was never the problem. The problem was how quickly ordinary assumptions replaced simple professionalism. Captain Richard never verified a boarding pass. Crew members remained silent despite growing doubt. Passengers watched prejudice unfold before cameras quietly began recording. None of them knew who Marcus was. That ignorance was never their failure. Their failure was believing respect depended on status instead of humanity. Back inside the first-class cabin, Ava rested peacefully against her father's shoulder while the approaching footsteps outside drew closer with every passing second. Marcus remained exactly where he belonged. He had boarded this flight searching for honest answers, never imagining he would personally become the evidence. The humiliation was never part of his plan. The revelation was. And now the hidden audit had finally found what years of polished reports, carefully managed statistics, and reassuring presentations had failed to uncover. The airline's deepest problem had never been concealed inside forgotten files alone. It was still alive, breathing quietly in the everyday choices of people who believed nobody important was watching. Within moments, that belief was about to collapse forever. The quiet footsteps outside the aircraft continued drawing nearer, but inside the cabin, Captain Richard Coleman remained composed. He believed experience, reputation, and authority stood firmly behind every decision he had made. Few people knew how that confidence had been built over decades, or how it had slowly changed the man everyone admired. Richard had spent nearly 30 years in the cockpit. His photograph appeared in company magazines beside headlines celebrating leadership, professionalism, and commitment to passenger safety. New pilots studied interviews describing his discipline and calm decision-making. At award ceremonies, executives praised his perfect safety record while employees applauded from crowded conference halls. To thousands of passengers, Captain Richard Coleman represented the airline at its very best. Families trusted him without hesitation whenever his voice welcomed them aboard. Yet behind the polished photographs and carefully prepared speeches, another reputation quietly existed. It was spoken only in private conversations, never during official meetings, and rarely where senior leaders could hear. Away from cameras, Richard expected immediate obedience. Junior crew members learned to choose every word carefully before approaching him. A delayed response could earn a sharp correction. An unnecessary question might become a negative performance review. Nobody claimed he shouted often. He rarely needed to. His reputation carried enough weight to silence disagreement before conversations even began. Flight attendants reminded one another to avoid unnecessary conflict. New employees quickly noticed that challenging Richard usually created more problems than solving them. Over time, professional respect slowly transformed into quiet fear. Honest communication became cautious agreement. Suggestions disappeared. Concerns remained unspoken. The cockpit stayed calm, but outside it, people learned that keeping peace sometimes meant hiding uncomfortable truths. Years earlier, during cabin crew orientation, a senior instructor addressed a classroom filled with nervous recruits preparing for their first assignments. She reviewed emergency procedures before offering one final piece of advice. Don't argue with the captain. Everyone nodded. Operational discipline depended upon clear authority during emergencies. The lesson itself was important. Yet outside genuine safety situations, those words gradually gained another meaning. Employees repeated them whenever difficult personalities created uncomfortable situations. A former flight attendant later admitted she ignored behavior that troubled her because colleagues whispered the same warning. Don't argue with the captain. Eventually, the phrase stopped protecting safe operations and started protecting unquestioned authority. Conscience remained trapped behind fear, while silence became the easiest choice. Whenever concerns reached senior management, attention quietly shifted toward preserving Richard's image. Internal emails emphasized his years of service, impressive record, and value to the airline. Managers often described complaints as misunderstandings requiring no further action. Investigations ended before difficult questions reached executive offices. Richard continued receiving awards while unresolved concerns settled inside confidential archives beside countless other forgotten files. Each decision strengthened the belief that reputation mattered more than reflection. Employees noticed which voices received protection and which quietly disappeared. Without intending to, management taught everyone the same lesson. Powerful people were defended first. Ordinary concerns could wait. The public never saw those meetings. The memory quietly faded as the first-class cabin returned. Richard still stood confidently before Marcus and Ava, convinced experience had placed him beyond a serious challenge. Every order he gave felt completely justified because no meaningful consequence had ever followed similar decisions before. Years of unquestioned authority had convinced him that certainty was wisdom. Around him, the crew remained silent, passengers continued recording, and Ava held her father's hand without speaking. Richard believed airport security would soon confirm everything he already believed. He could not imagine another outcome. Yet the hidden truth waiting beyond the aircraft door cared nothing about reputation, awards, or decades of respected service. For the first time in many years, certainty itself had become his greatest weakness. The privilege that had quietly protected him for decades was beginning to disappear, one calm moment at a time, and he still could not see it coming until truth finally stepped aboard. Before airport security reached the aircraft door, one passenger quietly pressed the upload button. The video lasted only 20 seconds. It showed Marcus seated calmly beside Ava, his boarding pass resting in his hand. Captain Richard stood nearby, firmly instructing him to move to another cabin. No shouting echoed through the recording. No dramatic struggle unfolded. The quietness became its strongest detail. Passengers watched without speaking while flight attendants remained frozen between policy and authority. The clip ended before anyone learned who Marcus was or why he refused to surrender his assigned seat. Yet the silence captured inside those brief seconds carried questions impossible to ignore, inviting strangers everywhere to fill empty spaces with assumptions before facts finally arrived later. The clip appeared online beneath a simple caption, "Why won't this black father leave?" Within moments, comments multiplied faster than anyone expected. Some viewers immediately defended the captain, insisting airline crews deserved unquestioned cooperation. Others wondered why no one had verified the boarding pass before demanding compliance. Thousands debated confidently despite seeing only 20 unfinished seconds. Parents noticed Ava's frightened expression. Former airline employees questioned missing procedures. Others dismissed concerns without hesitation. Every shared opinion pushed the story farther across social media. The internet moved quickly, rewarding certainty over patience. Few admitted they lacked the full picture, yet millions already believed they understood exactly what had happened aboard that waiting aircraft before evidence emerged. Within the hour, the recording reached audiences far beyond ordinary social media circles. Local journalists noticed unusual engagement before national reporters began forwarding the clip between newsrooms. Civil rights advocates recognized familiar patterns hidden beneath the apparently routine disagreement. They had seen countless stories where calm behavior became suspicious simply because of appearance. Commentators urged caution while demanding facts instead of assumptions. Others asked why nobody inside the cabin challenged the captain's decision. What first resembled an ordinary seating dispute slowly transformed into something larger. The discussion expanded beyond one passenger and one flight, touching uncomfortable questions about bias, authority, public silence, and the invisible burdens many travelers quietly carried every single journey through airports nationwide together. Inside television newsrooms, producers resisted rushing incomplete stories onto evening broadcasts. Instead, several investigative reporters started examining the airline itself. Archived articles, employee interviews, and forgotten complaint records gradually surfaced during careful research. A pattern began appearing where isolated incidents no longer seemed entirely isolated. Former passengers described remarkably similar experiences separated by years and different airports. Confidential sources hinted that unresolved concerns had quietly circulated within company departments long before today's confrontation. Editors recognized the importance of accuracy over speed, assigning investigative teams instead of opinion panels. The central question quietly changed. Reporters stopped asking whether one disagreement had occurred, and started asking how many earlier warnings might have disappeared before reaching public attention across years, unnoticed, while conversations intensified across the internet. The airline's executive offices remained noticeably quiet. Public relations staff drafted cautious statements but received no approval to release them. Senior managers waited for additional information, hoping events might settle before becoming an international headline. Inside employee break rooms, whispered conversations replaced ordinary lunchtime chatter. Several workers recognized details matching situations they had witnessed before but never discussed openly. Some worried cameras had finally captured what written complaints never fully conveyed. Outside the company, public confidence shifted with every passing hour. Inside headquarters, silence grew heavier than explanation. Every minute without answers encouraged further questions, while the uploaded recording continued, preserving an ordinary-looking moment that no longer seemed ordinary to anyone watching anywhere. Cabin remained still after another passenger quietly slipped a phone back into a jacket pocket. Nobody announced what had just been recorded, yet everyone seemed to understand that the moment no longer belonged only to those inside the aircraft. The silence settled differently now, carrying doubt instead of certainty. Near the galley, Emily Carter adjusted her uniform, but her attention never left Marcus and Ava. Something inside her refused to accept the explanation she had been repeating to herself. She had seen nervous passengers before. She had seen seating disputes. This felt different. Marcus had never argued. Ava had never cried, yet suspicion had somehow become stronger than evidence. A memory surfaced without warning. Months earlier, another black passenger had quietly apologized after being questioned twice despite holding a valid ticket. Emily remembered the apology because it never should have been necessary. She also remembered reading the complaint afterward. Nothing changed. Standing there now, she realized today's scene looked painfully familiar. Her stomach tightened. The company she admired suddenly seemed capable of repeating the same mistake. She looked toward Marcus again. He simply rested one reassuring hand over Ava's fingers. Neither demanded attention. Their calm made everyone else's discomfort impossible to ignore. Emily quietly whispered to herself, "We've been here before." The words barely escaped her lips, but they carried a truth she had spent months avoiding. For the first time since joining the airline, she wondered whether professionalism had slowly become another name for looking away whenever authority made people uncomfortable. Emily glanced toward another junior attendant standing beside the beverage cart. Their eyes met for only a second before she leaned closer and whispered, "Something feels wrong." The sentence was almost impossible to hear above the quiet sounds of passengers settling into their seats, yet it landed with surprising force. The other attendant swallowed before answering. "I know." Neither woman looked toward the captain while speaking. They did not need to. Richard's confident voice still echoed through the cabin, but certainty no longer sounded the same after watching Marcus quietly remain respectful despite repeated accusations. Emily folded a service towel simply to keep her hands busy. "He showed his boarding pass," she murmured. "Why wasn't that enough?" Her coworker hesitated before replying, "Because nobody wanted to question him." The answer lingered between them. Across the aisle, another crew member pretended to organize overhead compartments while clearly listening. No one openly joined the conversation, yet several uneasy glances passed through the cabin. Even passengers sensed something shifting. The silence surrounding the captain no longer felt supportive. It felt uncertain. Emily watched Ava resting against her father's shoulder, trying to understand why adults suddenly seemed afraid of kindness. That image stayed with her more than any command Richard had given. She realized the strongest voice inside the aircraft belonged neither to Marcus nor the captain. It belonged to conscience, quietly asking questions nobody wanted to answer. Before another word could be spoken, senior flight attendant Karen Mitchell stepped from the forward galley. She surveyed the crew with practiced precision until her eyes settled on Emily. Karen did not raise her voice. She did not ask what had been said. She simply delivered one steady, unmistakable look. Emily immediately understood its meaning. Enough. Return to work. Challenge nothing. The brief exchange lasted only seconds, yet it silenced every conversation more effectively than an order ever could. Emily lowered her eyes and reached for a stack of safety cards. Around her, the remaining attendants resumed their duties with careful professionalism. Drinks were arranged. Bags were checked. Seat belts were confirmed. Everything appeared normal again. Inside, however, normal no longer felt honest. Karen quietly walked past without another word. She believed she had restored order, but what she actually restored was fear. Several crew members avoided looking toward Marcus altogether. Others focused intensely on routine tasks, hoping responsibility might distract them from guilt. No one defended the captain aloud. No one defended Marcus either. That lesson suddenly felt far more frightening than any formal rule written inside the airline handbook. Service preparations continued, but almost every movement now felt automatic. Emily counted meal trays twice before realizing she had already finished. Another attendant poured water into a paper cup and forgot where it belonged. Nobody mentioned the mistakes. Their attention remained divided between routine responsibilities and the quiet conflict unfolding only a few rows away. Emily remembered orientation training where supervisors proudly described the airline as a family built on respect. She had believed every word. Now another question entered her mind. How many passengers had smiled politely before leaving the aircraft carrying humiliation nobody else acknowledged? She thought about complaints she had dismissed as isolated misunderstandings. She thought about coworkers who transferred departments without explanation. Each memory returned carrying a different meaning. Following procedure had once felt honorable. Today, it felt painfully close to helping unfairness survive. Emily glanced toward the cabin door, wishing someone outside the company would walk aboard and simply ask everyone what really happened. Instead, only silence answered her thoughts. Marcus remained composed, speaking softly to Ava while protecting her from fear he could not completely hide. Watching them made Emily understand that dignity required far more courage than authority. For the first time, remaining quiet felt less like professionalism and more like participation. That realization settled deeply, refusing to disappear. Captain Richard still believed complete control rested firmly in his hands. He stood near the front of the cabin expecting another routine resolution, unaware that the atmosphere surrounding him had quietly transformed. The passengers remained seated. The crew continued working. Nothing outwardly dramatic had changed. Yet, inside countless minds, certainty had begun giving way to uncomfortable reflection. Emily straightened her uniform and looked once more toward Marcus. She still said nothing aloud, but her silence no longer belonged to fear alone. It carried the beginning of responsibility. Nearby, crew members exchanged brief glances that needed no explanation. Nobody openly challenged Richard. Nobody defended his assumptions with confidence anymore either. Invisible lines had shifted. Loyalty built on unquestioned obedience had begun separating from respect earned through fairness. Marcus noticed the subtle change without acknowledging it. He simply kept holding Ava's hand, allowing calm to accomplish what anger never could. Outside the aircraft, another world waited unknowingly. Inside, the first real cracks had appeared long before any official investigation or public revelation. The system itself remained standing, but individual consciences were beginning to move. Sometimes change did not arrive with speeches, applause, or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it started with ordinary people quietly recognizing that what once felt acceptable no longer felt right. And once that recognition took root, even the strongest walls of silence could never feel completely secure again. The last, quiet conversation disappeared the moment measured footsteps entered the first-class cabin. 2 airport security officers walked steadily down the aisle, neither rushing nor hesitating. Their calm presence ended every remaining whisper without a single request for silence. Passengers instinctively straightened in their seats. Several people who had been discreetly recording tightened their grip on their phones but lowered them slightly, unsure whether to continue filming. Even the flight attendants paused in place, waiting to see what would happen next. Captain Richard Coleman lifted his chin with renewed confidence, convinced the situation was finally moving in the direction he expected. He believed the officers had arrived to remove an uncooperative passenger, restoring the authority he felt had been questioned. Emily watched from the galley entrance, her heartbeat growing louder than anything else inside the aircraft. She silently hoped someone would finally ask the one question nobody else had bothered asking from the beginning. The officers continued forward until they reached Marcus and Ava. Neither officer displayed suspicion nor hostility. Their expressions remained professional, free from assumptions. Around the cabin, anticipation settled over every row like a heavy blanket. No one could predict what would happen next, yet everyone understood that this moment would determine whose version of events survived after the aircraft doors finally closed. Every eye remained fixed on the quiet meeting unfolding before them. Even the smallest movement suddenly seemed important, and nobody dared interrupt the silence that had taken control of the cabin. Marcus looked up as the officer stopped beside his seat. He offered a calm nod before returning one reassuring glance toward Ava. She had reopened her small book and quietly traced a finger beneath each sentence, trusting her father's steady presence more than the worried faces surrounding them. Marcus rested both hands gently together across his lap. There was no sign of frustration, no restless movement, no attempt to defend himself before being asked. His stillness carried a quiet confidence that unsettled everyone expecting resistance. Richard noticed it too, but interpreted the composure as stubbornness. "You see?" he said firmly to the officers. "I've already explained the situation." Marcus never interrupted. He simply waited. The difference between the two men became impossible to ignore. One depended on authority to control the room. The other relied entirely on patience. Emily noticed several passengers lowering their phones, not because they had lost interest, but because they wanted to watch with their own eyes instead of through a screen. Ava glanced toward her father and whispered, "Everything's okay?" Marcus smiled softly. "We're going to let everyone do their job." His answer contained neither fear nor sarcasm. It was simple enough for a child to understand, yet powerful enough to reshape the mood around them. A passenger across the aisle quietly exhaled, realizing dignity sometimes spoke more clearly than outrage. Without intending to, Marcus had already begun changing the room simply by refusing to surrender his calm. The older security officer stepped forward with respectful professionalism. His tone remained even as he addressed Marcus directly. "Good afternoon, sir. May I please see your boarding pass?" Marcus reached calmly into the pocket of his jacket and removed the folded document. "Of course," he replied, handing it over without hesitation. The officer accepted it with both hands instead of giving it the quick glance others had offered earlier. Beside him, his younger partner opened a secure handheld device connected to the airline's reservation system. Richard folded his arms confidently, expecting the verification to confirm his judgment within seconds. Emily silently held her breath. The officer unfolded the boarding pass carefully, reading every printed detail before comparing it against the digital reservation. He checked the passenger name, the flight number, the assigned seat. Then he reviewed the booking profile one line at a time without rushing. No assumptions guided the process, only facts. Marcus waited patiently while Ava returned to her book, seemingly untroubled by the growing silence. Several passengers exchanged uncertain glances. They had expected confrontation, not careful procedure. Richard shifted slightly, surprised that something so straightforward appeared to require such close attention. The officer continued reading, refusing to skip even the smallest detail. For the first time since boarding began, someone inside the cabin was allowing evidence to speak before authority. That simple choice quietly changed the direction of everything unfolding around them. The officer's eyes stopped on one confidential line hidden beneath the ordinary reservation details. His expression did not dramatically change, but the smallest pause revealed he had discovered something unexpected. He looked once more at Marcus, then back to the screen to confirm what he was reading. Attached to the booking was a restricted executive ownership identifier, visible only to authorized personnel with enhanced security clearance. The younger officer noticed the pause and leaned slightly closer. His partner subtly turned the screen just enough for him to see without drawing attention from anyone nearby. Recognition immediately replaced uncertainty. Neither officer spoke. Neither reacted outwardly. Years of professional training kept their faces composed despite understanding the extraordinary significance of the information before them. Richard remained unaware, interpreting the silence as routine verification. Emily sensed something had changed even without knowing why. The atmosphere no longer felt tense because of Marcus. It felt tense because the officer suddenly understood far more than anyone else in the cabin. The older officer carefully folded the boarding pass exactly as Marcus had handed it over. He met Marcus's eyes for a brief moment. Nothing was spoken, yet quiet respect passed between them. Marcus simply nodded once, neither surprised nor relieved. He had expected professionalism, nothing more. Around them, passengers waited anxiously, unable to understand why a simple seat verification had become so unexpectedly careful and deliberate. The officer returned the boarding pass with steady hands. "Thank you, sir," he said politely. Marcus accepted it with the same calm expression he had carried since boarding. Instead of addressing Richard or explaining what he had discovered, the officer stepped back into the aisle. His partner remained beside him while he slowly reached toward the radio clipped to his uniform. Every movement was controlled, measured, almost deliberate enough to avoid attracting unnecessary attention. Yet that restraint created a heavier silence than any public announcement could have produced. Richard watched impatiently, expecting immediate support for his decision. None came. Emily noticed the officer speaking quietly into the radio, careful that only dispatch could hear his words. Whatever message he delivered remained private, but its urgency was unmistakable. The younger officer subtly positioned himself between Marcus and the rest of the cabin, not as a barrier against Marcus, but as quiet protection around him. Several passengers immediately sensed the shift. Phones rose again. Whispers never returned. The captain frowned for the first time since the confrontation began, confused by an outcome that no longer matched his expectations. Without raising his voice or revealing confidential information, the officer had changed the balance of the entire cabin. The system Richard trusted had quietly recognized someone he had completely failed to see, and the truth was now moving silently toward the aircraft with every passing second. The older security officer stepped quietly into the forward galley and lowered his voice before touching the radio again. "I need the airport director immediately," he said. "This requires confidential verification before anyone takes another step." His words were calm, but the careful choice of language caught everyone's attention. He never mentioned Marcus's name aloud. He simply explained that the passenger involved matched a restricted executive record requiring immediate confirmation. Emily noticed his expression change. He was no longer investigating a seating dispute. He was protecting the integrity of a decision that suddenly carried enormous consequences. Richard overheard enough to shake his head. "That can't be right," he said with a dismissive laugh. "You've pulled the wrong file." His confidence sounded forced now. No crew member answered. Karen lowered her eyes while younger attendants exchanged uneasy glances. Inside the operations office, managers hurried to access the secure database. Passwords were entered. Authorization codes appeared. Seconds later, Marcus Ellison's confidential ownership profile filled the screen. Every conversation stopped. Nobody celebrated. Nobody argued. One manager slowly removed his glasses while another whispered, "Confirm it again." The second search produced the same result. Silence became the only possible response. News traveled quietly through the executive hallway. Phones rang one after another, yet every voice grew softer instead of louder. Leaders who had trusted reputation more than evidence suddenly understood what was unfolding aboard the aircraft. Protecting appearances was no longer the priority. Protecting the truth had become unavoidable. Back inside first class, passengers remained unaware of the growing urgency beyond the cabin walls. Marcus sat beside Ava with unchanged composure while the institution surrounding him quietly began questioning itself. Without announcements, accusations, or raised voices, Certainty slowly surrendered to accountability, and the system finally started examining the assumptions it had defended for far too long. Beyond the cabin, the confirmation moved quietly through offices, terminals, and staff corridors, awakening memories that many employees believed had been forgotten. Reservation clerks paused over computer screens. Supervisors stopped mid-conversation. Ordinary moments from previous years suddenly returned with uncomfortable clarity. A passenger questioned twice. A family delayed without explanation. A complaint politely acknowledged before disappearing into another file. None of those incidents had seemed extraordinary alone. Together, they formed a pattern impossible to ignore. Employees began wondering whether routine had slowly disguised injustice, allowing unfair treatment to survive behind familiar procedures. In the baggage area, Thomas, a veteran handler with 20 years of service, rested both hands against a luggage cart. He remembered a frightened black family surrounded by embarrassed children after a simple boarding mistake. He had watched from across the loading bay, convincing himself it belonged to customer service, not him. Now, the memory returned unchanged, except for the weight it carried. Quietly wiping his eyes, he whispered, "I should have said something." Elsewhere, a gate agent finally admitted what others had only thought. "We all knew," she said softly. Nobody challenged her. Nobody defended the past. The words hung heavily because everyone understood their truth. They had noticed the pattern but trusted someone higher to correct it. Inside employee break rooms, conversations no longer centered on protecting procedures or defending respected leaders. Instead, co-workers exchanged uncertain glances and quietly questioned decisions they once accepted without hesitation. Even Captain Richard Coleman's strongest supporters spoke with careful restraint. The certainty that had protected old habits was disappearing. The narrator reminds us that many employees were not motivated by hatred, but by fear, routine, and pressure to obey. Their guilt could never erase the pain others endured, yet acknowledging it became the first honest step toward meaningful change. Only after admitting silence had consequences could the airline finally begin earning trust again. As airline employees confronted uncomfortable memories, the 20-second recording continued traveling far beyond the airport. Investigative journalists who first dismissed it as another online controversy returned with renewed interest after hearing whispers about confidential records and older complaints. They requested archived reports, compared public filings, and interviewed former employees who had quietly left the company years earlier. The deeper they looked, the clearer the pattern became. The confrontation inside first class no longer appeared to be one unfortunate misunderstanding. It resembled the latest chapter in a much longer story. Encouraged by growing attention, former passengers began sharing experiences they had hidden out of embarrassment. A retired teacher described being questioned repeatedly despite holding a valid ticket. A young engineer remembered being escorted aside while other travelers walked through without interruption. A mother recalled comforting her son after strangers openly doubted they belonged together in premium seating. Every account carried different details, yet each reflected the same painful lesson. Appearance had too often outweighed dignity. As interviews multiplied across television broadcasts and social media platforms, isolated stories gradually connected into one undeniable record. Reporters organized complaints by date, airport, crew assignments, and internal responses. What once seemed like scattered misunderstandings now revealed repeated patterns impossible to dismiss. Public opinion shifted steadily as documented evidence replaced speculation and emotional arguments. Headlines also changed. Instead of asking whether Captain Richard Coleman had acted unfairly, journalists began asking why similar complaints had survived for years without meaningful action. Attention moved away from one individual toward the culture that allowed repeated failures to continue. Inside the airline, carefully protected confidence weakened with every new testimony. Former employees, witnesses, and passengers recognized they were no longer speaking alone. The silence that had shielded old habits slowly lost its power as truth traveled farther than fear ever could, reaching people determined to listen rather than look away at last. The growing wave of testimony left the airline with no room to wait. Confidential calls reached the highest levels of leadership, interrupting meetings, delaying appointments, and sending board members toward the airport with unusual urgency. Assistants canceled schedules without explanation. Senior executives spoke in calm, measured voices that carried unmistakable concern. No one discussed profits, departures, or flight delays. Every conversation centered on the same question: how had a routine boarding process become a crisis threatening the company's credibility? Inside the terminal, familiar routines continued. But beneath them, leadership understood events had moved beyond ordinary operational control. Meanwhile, Captain Richard Coleman remained convinced the confusion resulted from an administrative mistake. "This has to be some kind of joke," he muttered, shaking his head. "Someone entered the wrong information." Each warning strengthened his certainty instead of weakening it. Around him, colleagues stopped offering agreement. Emily quietly stepped farther away. Karen folded her hands without speaking. Even those who had trusted Richard for years now chose silence over reassurance. In executive corridors, supervisors and department heads gathered outside restricted offices, exchanging worried glances instead of confident opinions. Nobody wanted to defend conclusions that facts might soon destroy. A senior operations manager approached Richard carefully. "Captain, perhaps we should pause until verification is complete," another added. "A respectful apology now costs nothing if this becomes a misunderstanding." Richard dismissed both suggestions immediately. "There is nothing to apologize for," he replied. "I know exactly what I'm doing." His refusal quietly transformed confidence into isolation. Moments later, the board members entered the terminal together. Conversations stopped without instruction. Employees instinctively stepped aside as the leadership team walked toward the aircraft with calm determination.